Hey, this is Kyle Anderson from Brand of Sacrifice, and here are my thoughts on Revolver's 15 essential deathcore albums. First deathcore record that I listened to was Allegiance by As Blood Runs Black from 2006. And shortly after that, I saw Despised Icon, Carnifex, and Beneath the Massacre in Toronto. And that was my first show for deathcore. Around that time, I was playing in metalcore bands, and I never really dabbled in deathcore until Brand of Sacrifice itself. But this isn't about Brand of Sacrifice, this is about the 15 essential albums that shaped the genre deathcore. Let's get into it. First up, we have the Acacia strain with their album Wormwood. So my first experience with this band was actually the song Whoa, Shut It Down. A friend of mine had that on her MySpace page, and I was instantly hooked on the band. I think there's a little bit more of like a hardcore influence within the band at that time. And Wormwood explores more of the down-tempo, lower-tuned guitars. I think they did a lot of cool things, and I definitely think it belongs on the list as a very influential and top deathcore record. Next up, we have The Price of Existence from All Shall Perish. So my first experience with this band was actually riding the bus home from one of my first band practices. The song that I heard was There's No Business to Be Done on a Dead Planet. And I remember being absolutely mesmerized by the pig squeals in that track. I wanted to learn how to do that specifically. And it's actually something that I utilized quite often in Brand of Sacrifice. So it was definitely influenced by that record itself and that song specifically. I think this is a super iconic record. I don't think anybody would remove this from the list at all. Next up, we got Dissentient by AngelMaker. This is definitely one of the more modern records on the list, which is funny because this band purposely makes old school sounding deathcore. So I think this record is really cool because it utilizes things like old school tremolo riffs, breakdowns, gang vocals. These are all things that people loved and adored about the old school style of deathcore. Being a new band and throwing it back to the old days, this band definitely deserves to be on the list. Next up, I'm stoked to talk about the first album I ever heard in the deathcore genre, As Blood Runs Black's Allegiance. I really can't believe that this album is 15 years old to start off. I remember walking out of my English class in 11th grade, walking out the door, turning on my RCA MP3 player, and putting on My Fears Have Become Phobias for the first time, blasting it in my headphones, and hearing the double bass part at the end of the song and just being absolutely blown away, thinking it wasn't possible to play that. I hadn't heard anything like that before. I personally think this record set a precedent for deathcore, in a sense. Specifically relating to extremity. More bands wanted to have faster parts. More bands wanted to have heavier breakdowns. And they still utilized the mellow death influence in their riffs, but they always had these extreme breakdowns and speed parts, which definitely influenced other deathcore bands to utilize those things and take it a step further. Next up, we have Count Your Blessings by Bring Me the Horizon. So I'm kicking it back to 11th grade English class once again. My friend Jeremy shows me this band called Bring Me the Horizon and says, here, listen to my iPod. There's a song called Pray for Plagues that I want you to hear. And I listened to it. And I remember that was one of the first times I ever heard an O before a breakdown. This album is quite extreme too, to be honest. It's got quite a bit of speed. It's got very raw production, very clicky kick drum that you wouldn't hear in today's modern metal. So some would argue that because they only have one release that's deathcore, they may not be considered influential. But I would disagree with that because they brought in a totally new demographic and got them stoked on other bands that were involved within that. Next up, we got Die Without Hope by Carnifex. Right now, black and deathcore is extremely popular, with bands like Lorna Shore, for example, leading the way. But I think this band really dialed that in with this record. They had dabbled with it in the past with their album Hell Chose Me. So this is their first record back after a hiatus. This is their first record to utilize their lead guitarist at the time, Jordan Lockery, and this is their first record on Nuclear Blast, which really solidified them in the scene as a force to be reckoned with in the grand scheme of metal. So if it was my choice, I would have picked Dead in My Arms because there's songs that are anthems like Lie to My Face and Slit Wrist Savior. That being said, this album solidified the black and deathcore sound for them, which is highly important to the scene at this time. So I think this record makes sense. Next album is Chelsea Grin's Desolation of Eden. Following in the footsteps of Bring Me the Horizon, this band brought more of a scene crowd to the mix. The band re-recorded a couple of songs from their EP, including the hit Recreant. I remember seeing the band on MySpace and being wowed that they were using 3 guitarists at the time. I think this band has done a lot of shape-shifting over the years. They started off with the more groovy, fret one influenced deathcore sound, and then shifted to sort of a gent-influenced progressive deathcore band at some points with utilizing clean singing. And now they've gone the more metalcore, deathcore synthesis style, which I think is really cool with the addition of vocalist Tom Barber. I think this band has both influenced and gone with the ebbs and flows of the scene, but this was more of their defining moment.
Next up, we have Despised Icon, The Healing Process.
So growing up in Canada, Despised Icon were the kings. This is where it all started. This record has more of a grind, sort of mathy metalcore influence as well on top of the death metal influence. It's more raw, and it utilizes 2 different vocalists with very different styles. Nowadays, it's sort of the standard to be able to pull off a lot of different techniques. So one thing to definitely note about this band is the difference between Alex and Steve's vocals. Alex utilizes the hardcore shouts, and Steve utilizes the more guttural and squealy death metal influenced vocals. But when they come together, it creates a synthesis that is something special. It's not something that you could create easily as a singular vocalist. Next up, we have For An Autopsy's Absolute Hope, Absolute Hell. This album is vocalist Joe Bad's first appearance. This band went from that deathcore sound to starting to utilize more groove influence, and they became deathcore's answer to Gojira almost. This band is the brainchild of Will Putney, who had a strong bearing on the scene from a production standpoint with bands like Thy Art Is Murder, Impending Doom, Winds of Plague, even prior to this record. This release surely was the stepping stone for producer Will Putney and become that big name that we know and love, and change the sound of deathcore and the landscape of it as a whole. Next up, we have Job for a Cowboy's Doom EP. This one I again heard through someone's MySpace page, and I remember being absolutely blown away by how raw the sound was, how young the band was that was producing this type of music. I believe they were teenagers at the time. They wore skinny jeans in the music video, and they had pig squeals, and some of the old heads weren't too stoked on that at the time, I remember. If I had to pick one of the most defining and influential records, I'd probably put this at the top. Next up, we have Neverbloom by Make Them Suffer. When I first heard this band's name, I knew it came from a Cannibal Corpse song, but I didn't know what they were going to sound like. They're more of a symphonic deathcore style. They have very prevalent, very loud in the mix, keyboards and orchestral elements. This is something that you still hear today with bands like my own or Lorna Shore. This band has since transitioned to more of a metalcore style at this point, but I still believe that this record belongs on this list for sure. Next up is Primordial by Shadow of Intent. So this is a band that actually took out my band Brand Sacrifice on tour back in early 2020. Ben struggled with some sickness on the tour. There was one show I remember specifically, I believe it was in Chicago, where he had no voice, he couldn't speak at all, and then absolutely decimated the set. The man is an absolute animal, one of the best in the scene, if not the best metal vocalist in my opinion. This was their humble beginnings. They were based upon the game Halo at the time, and they had more of, there actually was some mellow death influence in their riffing, which has since gone away as they progress as a band. In my opinion, I would probably pick a different album for this list, but this is definitely a good glimpse into what the band once was and where they came from. Next up is The Cleansing by Suicide Silence. So I remember skipping class in 11th grade, sitting in the school library, putting my headphones on and listening to The Cleansing for the first time. I believe it was a song, The Price of Beauty, and just being absolutely blown away by how heavy and raw and energetic this record was. Mitch's performance is haunting on this record, just absolutely brutal. And the thing that makes this record very special, it was actually recorded live off the floor. This is something you don't see typically too much in deathcore nowadays, because everything is generally recorded separately onto the grid, nice and tight and clean. But this is something that definitely makes this record special. If not for the Doom EP by JFAC, I would definitely put this as number 2 as the most influential deathcore album in history. Next up, we have Hate by Thy Art Is Murder. Reign of Darkness is probably one of deathcore's anthems for sure. To this day, you can't go to a venue and play a show without hearing that played between songs. This album was released in 2012, and I think at the time, deathcore was a little bit off people's radar. When this record came out, it was the hype album of the time. Even metalcore kids were jamming out to Hate. Just loved how groovy it was, loved how heavy it was, and the production at the time was really standout too. So I think this gave deathcore a nice kick in the ass. Last album on the list is This Is Exile by Whitechapel. I remember going to band practice in Newmarket, Ontario. My friend Dylan showed me this record. Actually, at first I didn't really like it. I thought it was too extreme, but then I grew to love it the more I listened, and that sort of fueled the fire for me getting into more extreme music in general. This album really showcases Phil Bozeman's incredible vocal capabilities. Extremely quick Tech 9 Busta Rhymes style fast vocal sections, and then the transitions between high screams, gutturals, lows. These are all things that were really standout at the time. The album had bounce, the album had groove, but it also had quick, thrashy, technical riffs as well here and there. The thing that I think stands out most about this album is the mosh calls. Those are my thoughts on Revolver's list, but there's a few substitutions that I would make. The first substitution that I would make would be for the Acacia strain, Wormwood for the Dead Walk. The second substitution that I would make would be Dead in My Arms for Die Without Hope by Carnifex. Third substitution that I would make would be The Healing Process for The Ills of Modern Man by Despised Icon. The final substitution I would make would be Primordial for Reclaimer by Shadow of Intent. These are my 5 additions: Decimate the Weak by Winds of Plague, Depths by Oceano, Bloodlust by Through the Eyes of the Dead, The Serpent Servant by Impending Doom, Carnal Repercussions by Salt the Wound. Thanks Revolver for having me. I'm Kyle from Brand of Sacrifice, and these are my thoughts on the 15 essential deathcore records. Let us know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you guys on tour.